Good afternoon everyone and happy Heritage Day. So today we're going to do something a bit different. I hope you'll find it interesting. What we'll do is we'll move around the city of Cape Town and we'll look at 3 trees. And these trees that we're going to look at have some significant value attached to them in terms of our heritage as not only Cape Townians but also South Africans. Now, in and around Cape Town, before the Europeans arrived, there were lots of small forests of trees. But when the Europeans arrived and they finally got a foothold into the country and they drove off the indigenous Khoi people and killed some of them, what they did then was they over time started planting pockets of trees, and they did this in waves over time. And many of those trees weren't indigenous, but they used those trees for construction, they used it for shade, and they used for fruit, and some also just for aesthetics, just because they look good. And so consequently, many of the what we could call heritage trees around Cape Town today have actually been introduced from Europe or other distant parts of the world that have historical trade links to the Cape. And so trees can actually be helpful as a starting point for journeys of learning, as someone put it, about our local history, and so we can find some rooting for ourselves as well, just in learning some new things about it. So we look at 3 trees. Now the tree that is standing here behind me is actually an ancient milkwood tree. Get a closer look at it. There's some folk in the background here making a bit of noise. But this is an ancient milkwood tree and is actually known as the treaty tree. And later on it was also called the slave tree. It's over 500 years old, and the ground we are standing on actually used to be Cape Town's original beachfront. So if you look that way, this was all beach ground. Milkwoods usually grow close to the beach, and further that way on the beach there was actually a whaling station, which is quite interesting. So coming back to this tree is named the treaty tree to commemorate the British occupation of the Cape. And it was here, following the Battle of Blouberg that happened in the year 1806, fighting over land that didn't belong to either of them, that the victorious British forces regrouped and they defeated the Dutch in what is called the Battle of Blouberg. And here under this tree they signed the admission of defeat conditions, which effectively transferred control of the Cape from the Dutch over to Britain. But then also in later years the tree became known as the old slave tree of Woodstock, and under this tree slave masters bought and sold humans like livestock. So that happened here, and so it was also a place where disobedient slaves were hung. So that's the first tree we'll look at. We'll move on to the next tree now. So this is the second tree. I'm actually standing in Cape Town city centre now on Spin Street. I must apologize for the quality of the video. There's such a lot of noise around. I'm actually standing at a site of where a tree used to be but now no longer is. So there's a plaque that has been set up here with a little bit of a raised step commemorating where the tree used to be. It used to be an old fir tree. It stood here for hundreds of years until 1916 when it was cut down. I know that there isn't a tree here, but I included it because it's part of a history that many South Africans don't know about. You can see that it was removed, this tree, when the city was being further developed. And today, in the absence of that tree, there's, as I described, this raised plaque wedged on a traffic island in the middle of the road. And on the plaque, it's faintly inscribed with the words, "On this spot stood the old slave tree." Now, under this tree, an estimated 100,000 people were sold into slavery. So people were caught, enslaved, and brought here from other parts of Africa, India, Indonesia, from the year 1656 onwards. And when they arrived here at the Cape, they were given new names by their masters, names after months of the year in which they were bought. Example, February or September. When I grew up, my neighbor across the road, his surname was February, and he had slave heritage. Or they were also given names from characters from the Bible, like Abraham or Adam or Eve. And then they were also given names that had some classical mythological aspect to it. Names like Apollos or Adonis. And so those people who have those names, who have that heritage, are actually connected to this particular spot in our city. So we're at the site of the third tree now, and it's actually on Long Street, just outside of a mosque, and the mosque is called Palm Tree Mosque. And or in Afrikaans we call it a Dadelboom Mosque. Now this tree was planted somewhere around 1780. So this tree is about 200 years old. I know some of you might have Muslim friends, so this is quite interesting. But in Islamic culture, palm trees are very symbolic. They appear around oases to signal water as a gift from their god Allah. They are said to grow in the Islamic paradise, or at least their heaven that they call Jannah. And in the Quran, it is actually recorded, according to them, that Jesus was born under a palm tree. So Muslims do acknowledge Jesus, but they don't believe that he is God. So that's the third tree. Quite interesting. There used to be two of them, but the other one was blown down in a windstorm somewhere in the 1960s, and they planted a little one right next door to get going again. So I'm back in Pinelands. I hope you found some of that interesting. At some of those trees, I just needed to take a moment just to think about everything transpired at those particular sites. It's quite a lot to take in when you think about it, and just also to recognize how history and our heritage has shaped who we have become as people. But as we wrap up, as we were looking at all of those trees, there was something that reminded me from a particular narrative that runs throughout Scripture. And one particular verse came to me. But as we look at that, I just wanted to remind you that, in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's a period of 400 years. And a lot of scholars call that the period of silence, because it seemed like God was absent to his people. Towards the end of the Old Testament, it was a period of time where the Israelites were unsettled. They was struggling as a nation to re-establish themselves, having come back from a time of exile. And so it was a really difficult time for them. And so for them, to an extent, it felt dry, um, unfertile, almost like the stump that I'm leaning up against. That there was a time once when they were fruitful and productive, but they had been cut down. And there's a particular scripture that I'm reminded of in Isaiah. During that time, Isaiah spoke these prophetic words to this nation that felt like a stump that had been cut. And it comes from Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, and this is what it says, these words of prophecy. Isaiah said, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord." So the prophet Isaiah spoke these prophetic words, which were in effect words of hope, to a nation that felt like this stump. And then he says, out of this dry stump will come a shoot, out of the line of Jesse into David, that would lead to Jesus as we now know. And then in reflection, quite interestingly, even after Jesus had come, incarnated himself here, he spoke through the prophet of John in the book of Revelation. And he said in Revelation chapter 22 verse 16 of himself, he said, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright morning star." You know, I think we find ourselves in a time now where we feel dry, we feel unfertile. It feels like we had been progressing, we had been growing, and all of a sudden in the season we have been cut down like a tree that is now a stump. But even in the way that Isaiah was able to speak prophetically a word of hope to God's people, today we still have promises and hope that we can hold on to in God's promises. So let me encourage you with that today, on this Heritage Weekend, that the promises of God remain, and then out of even something that feels like a dead stump, God is able to bring new life. God bless you.